Hi, I'm Lelia Goehring. I am your new Director of Facilities, Planning, and Construction, and I am here today to walk you through the major milestones that happen during a design process. I want to also let you know who the major players are and what the deliverables of each of those phases. So the first phase is capital planning, and we move through capital planning by using design partners as well as stakeholder groups. For our current process, we have used our Bond Advisory Committee, our Citizens Advisory Committee, and we've engaged a number of design partners to run facility assessments. So in capital planning, we have our BAC, our CAC, and we have our design partners. They produced, for our current bond, a number of assessments. We have an MEP assessment that was done by EMA. We have a safety and security assessment that was done by True North. And we have the architectural assessment, which was performed by Corrigan. These documents become the heart of the project. This is the first takeoff point, and it fuels the rest of the development. Our next phase is pre-design. Some people also call this concept. In this phase, we are beginning to engage our design partners. At this point, you usually have your architect involved, and they're beginning to lay out the first conceptual phase. So they're taking the information that was developed by capital planning, and they are beginning to formulate how that fits into the actual building project, renovation. And so the major deliverables in that pre-design phase are a program. And for those who aren't familiar with a program, it really is a schedule of work. It outlines in detail all of the parts and pieces that need to occur as part of the project. And so this phase here really is the first checks and balance that occurs to make sure that we are honoring the planning that was done before, and to make sure that the project itself, that the scope and the budget are in alignment. So you'll have an architect, and they will engage an individual to do a cost assessment. The next phase is schematic design. In schematic design, again, it builds on the previous phase. So it builds on pre-design. We still have our architect engaged, but what you'll begin to see is other design partners will begin to filter in. You'll start seeing your safety security coming back in. You're going to start seeing your MEP, all of your design partners and their affiliated consultants really begin to ramp up in this phase. So I'll say architect and design partners to cover everybody. The major deliverable out of schematic design is, again, if you remember here, we're talking about a list of scope. Here, this is beginning to get more defined. We're outlining where scope occurs in what areas and to what extent. Again, at the end of this, we also have an estimate that's provided. So what I'm going to say as our deliverable here is a booklet. And in that booklet, depending on the type of project, you begin to see, if it's new construction, you begin to see big picture ideas of how the building's going to lay out. You begin to see elevations. Those sort of conversations come into play. If it's a renovation, you start seeing more specific detail of what type of work I'm doing in which areas and what the extent is. And again, same thing, it builds on the previous phases and it has an estimate at the end. Documentation, this comprises of a couple of items. This comprises of design development and construction documentation. This is where, again, each one of these has stakeholder engagement, but each one is a different level. In documentation, we've already told the architect and the design partners what our goals are. We've talked about our goals, we've talked about our major ideas. Now we're getting into really specific items. Which walls get power, which walls get data. We're getting into the real detail of the project. The first half of this phase will continue to have stakeholder engagement at, again, more specific levels. But the latter half is when the architect is taking everything we've told them and they're putting it into the actual drawings that get built from. So you begin to see that engagement tapering off because we've communicated the information. They start reaching back out to us, asking very specific questions in specific areas. And the major deliverable here is the actual drawings that the building is built from. So to kind of follow what we were talking about before, we still have our architect, we have our MEP, we have our technology, we have our civil, we have full package. Depending on the scope, this list may vary, but we'll have safety security, we've got landscape, the full team, 100% engaged. Most of these members are also highly engaged in schematic design. But here, this is where they're all producing their drawings. So the final deliverable here, at the end of documentation, at the end of contract documents, we have our construction documents that result in a GMP. That GMP gets brought to the board, and the board takes action. And that's what starts the construction phase. So one of the ways that I like to visualize the design process is with a visualization of a tree. A tree starts with needing nutrients, it needs information. So that information is fueled by capital planning. All of our assessments, all of our planning and programming, that actually fuels the tree. So in my mind, that's roots. We've got a series of roots, it's got a lot of information, and all of those create the life force of the project. PreDesign, which we had talked about a minute ago, PreDesign is the overarching concept. So that is kind of a singular idea. We've got our tree, and that again is fed by our documents from capital planning. So this is a singular concept. It's where we begin to kind of look at it in an overarching view. So schematic design is where you start to see how this overarching concept breaks into individual areas. How does this overarching concept affect my library? How does it affect my gym? It becomes more about taking this singular idea and branching it into more areas. So as a tree concept, that's where we really begin to start seeing branches, major ideas. How do those branches feed back to the overarching pre-designed concept, and how is that fed by the root structure? The next area, as we mentioned before, is documentation, and this is where we're beginning to finish up our stakeholder meetings. We're beginning to get all that information. We have that, and this is where the architect and the design team is really putting this into the documents that get bid. So here, we're getting into very small decisions. Where does that power and data go? We're looking at very detailed choices at this point. The final aspect of this that we haven't spoken about is construction. All of this effort is pushing towards that final construction project. And if you think about that, that really is the fruits of our labors. So I'm going to go ahead and indicate that this tree is bearing fruit. Now, not all thoughts make it to the final end of the project. If we go down a certain road during any one of these points and we're doing our checks and balances, we could have portions of the tree that don't fruit. We could have ideas that don't make fruition. And that could be because of budget, it could be because our design concept evolved and changed as we met with our stakeholders. So I'm purposefully showing that portions of this tree aren't making it to that final construction, and that's intended. That's part of our process of checks and balances. At each one of these phases, when we do our checks and balances, there could be portions of the project that intentionally do not move forward.
My name's Mulroney. I'm the Chief Operations Officer for Carrollton-Farmers Branch ISD. As Lelia has covered some of the major milestones of the planning and construction process, I'd like to share some of the guiding philosophies that we have in the capital planning. Starting at the root section here, we start with the founding documents for the 2018 bond, which were created by the CAC, the Community Advisory Committee, which were given to the board and led to the passage of the 2018 bond. These have been reinforced by the Collaborative Vision 2030 process. This was an incredible process where we gathered over 60 community members, staff members, students, administrators, board members, all came together to say, what does our vision for 2030 look like? In the Collaborative Vision 2030, the strategic priority of optimized facilities, safety and security, and infrastructure to be adaptable to student needs has 3 objectives. These objectives are: 1, to develop and implement a framework for the passage and the follow-up bond every 4 years. Objective 2, design and maintain facilities to be adaptable to the changing learning experience and student engagement. And Objective 3, implement in all school facilities safety and security measures that meets the need of the whole person. This rounds off the philosophy for the root section. These 3 documents round out the founding philosophies that support the next step. In the pre-design, we require that our design teams develop a grand vision for each one of the campuses where we spend dollars. This way we know what that campus is going to look like in 10, 15, 20 years' time. And any dollars that get spent today in alignment to that grand vision. This is where we start to support the philosophy that some of those branches may not bear fruit this time round, but may come around for a later development project. However, some of it gets really complicated, and this is really the joy of construction and renovation projects, where you'll have branches that support other branches that do bear fruit, even though they themselves, they aren't bearing fruit.
I'm Bobby Shaw, the project manager here in Facility Services. To help you get a visualization of where we are in these processes, our capital planning stages is rolling out with our Phase 2 and Phase 3 schools, which are starting to take shape and will be growing up into our tree base. Smith and Perry projects are starting to take shape as they're in pre-design and rolling into schematic design phases. And as you may have seen in some of the past videos, projects like McCorder, Field, and Turner are starting to bud and bloom. If you would like for us to take any deeper dive on any specific projects, please leave a comment or contact us. Be sure to check out the Bond website as we pull out additional videos, photos, and exciting updates.